In March 1944, a group of Allied POWs escaped from Sagan POW camp in Lower Silesia. Gestapo and police officers throughout Germany were warned to be on the lookout for escaped prisoners. Eventually, nearly all of them were caught. On Saturday the 25th of March 1944, the Munich Kripo, the criminal police, received a telex warning that everyone had to be on the lookout for the men. There was also information about the escape and the suggestion that they would be in civilian clothes with false papers. At Munich, the criminal police officer assigned to the task was Anton Gassler. His idea was to concentrate the search on the railway stations, and this quickly produced results. Switzerland was a natural destination for the escapers, and most roads to Switzerland would have gone through Munich via train. The first escaped officer to be picked up was arrested near Donauwörth on an express train. The prisoner spoke very good German and made a positive impression on his captors. He asked Gassler what would happen to him. Gassler said he'd probably be sent back to the POW camp, but that was not a decision for him. The prisoner was returned to Sagan. The next two to be caught were both officers from the South African Air Force. They were Flight Lieutenant Rupert Stevens and Flight Lieutenant Johannes Hayes. I believe that Hayes is the correct pronunciation. I don't speak Afrikaans, but Hayes is actually spelled Gouws. One was caught on a train near Kaufbeuren, the other on a slow train near Rosenheim. They were both brought to prison in Munich on or before the 28th of March 1944. The investigation of these men was taken from the criminal police to the Gestapo. That in itself may not be as nefarious as it sounds. At the end of the day, the Gestapo were probably doing the investigations into these men. However, later in court, it did prove to be quite significant. In charge of the Gestapo in Munich was the 35-year-old Oswald Schaefer. His wartime career in the service of National Socialism included being part of an Einsatzkommando and murdering Jews and others in the occupied Soviet Union, as well as overseeing the investigation into the White Rose German resistance movement. Of course, his other crimes were many. On the night of the 29th of March 1944, Schaefer received a teleprint with the Hitler order to kill any Allied POWs who were recaptured. It was after duty hours and he sent his car to collect some of his staff. The car returned with the second in command, Martin Schirmer, as well as Eduard Geit and Johann Schneider. They were joined by Emil Weil, who was the duty officer. Weil was in a particularly difficult situation. He was 1/4 Jewish and a Gestapo officer. Had Schaefer found out, his fate would have been the same as for any other Jew in Munich. After a short conference with his second in command, Schaefer summoned the others and explained to them that on orders from the Reich Security Main Office, the two captured British prisoners held at Kripo headquarters were to be shot. He briefed them in accordance with the Hitler order. It was decided that Schneider, who had a Soviet submachine gun which he'd brought back with him from the Eastern Front, and because of his experience there did not mind doing the shooting, should kill the men, and that Schirmer should be put in charge of the party and give the order to shoot. All participants were pledged to secrecy by clasping of hands, a gesture associated with men about to go into battle. Once the procedure had been decided upon, the men got some rest for an hour or two. How they managed to do this before committing murder is beyond me. The prisoners, of course, had to be interrogated as per orders. That began at around 4 in the morning, but none of the 4 Germans spoke any English, and only one of the prisoners knew a few phrases in German. It seems as though the POWs told them their route through Germany and how they attempted to get to Switzerland. After about an hour, they were strip searched, the Gestapo being at pains to do this in a dignified manner in a warm room where the prisoners would not get cold. The prisoners were handcuffed and placed in the car in the forward-facing seats at the back. Weil and Geit sat in the folding seats opposite them. Schneider drove and Schirmer sat in the passenger seat. They were driven up the motorway in the direction of Ingolstadt for around 45 kilometers. At around 6 in the morning, they were told to get out and urinate. Schneider took his Soviet machine pistol, which was under the passenger seat, and inserted a magazine. He told Sherman to get out of the way and then shot the prisoners. One appeared to be still alive and he had to fire again. Having committed the murder, the four then made it look as though the prisoners had tried to escape by collecting the spent rounds in the forest and firing them pistols at trees to simulate a chase. Two policemen approached and asked what was going on. The Gestapo officers flashed their passes and told them that everything was under control. Sometime later, a doctor and a coroner appeared and, accepting the story of the Gestapo officers, agreed that there was nothing further to be done. The bodies were left in the care of one of the policemen, whilst the Gestapo officers returned to Munich with the now dead prisoners' effects, which were handed over to Schaefer. One effect was an unopened packet of cigarettes. Schaefer said to Geit that he may as well smoke them, and so they shared them amongst themselves. The prisoners also had some cash on them. Part of this cash was used to pay for their bodies to be burned in the municipal crematorium. Had the bodies been burned at Dachau concentration camp in the crematorium there, then there would have been no charge, and thus no paperwork. This snippet of information allowed later British investigators to trace what had happened to the pilots, and eventually to catch some of those involved in the murders. In May 1944, the British government had learned of the murders after a routine visit to the Sagan prisoner of war camp by the Swiss authorities as the protecting power. On the 19th of May 1944, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden announced this to the House of Commons. Shortly after the announcement, the senior British officer of the camp, Group Captain Herbert Massey, was repatriated to the United Kingdom due to ill health. Upon his return, he revealed how the escape had happened and how he'd been informed of the murders of the recaptured escapees. On the 23rd of June 1944, Eden announced that those responsible would be brought to exemplary justice. After the liberation of Germany, a team was set up to find the criminals. There was a lead in the south of Germany and a southern investigation team was set up under Flight Lieutenant Courtney. The Americans had set up an internment camp here in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. They were holding a former Munich criminal investigator, Anton Gassner. Gassner had fled from Munich and had gone to live with his sister at Bad Reichenau near Berchtesgaden. He was arrested there in June 1945. He was able to provide some details about the murder of the Allied airmen and reported on what he had heard of Schaefer's escape, which must have happened before he left. He said that the general opinion was that Schaefer was somewhere in the Tyrol and had probably committed suicide there. The British were able to trace and capture 3 Munich Gestapo officers and confirm that one, Shermer, had committed suicide. The 3, Weil, Geit and Schneider, were arrested. The case of Weil is particularly draconian. He had been the duty officer on the night that Schaefer had ordered the 2 South African pilots to be murdered. He was 1/4 Jewish and trying to hide it as best he could. He'd once been a police officer and had transferred to the Gestapo, whether voluntarily or not I cannot say. However, where better for an underground Jew to hide than in the Gestapo? He knew that the pilots were to be killed, but claimed that he thought that they'd already been found guilty by a court. He had gone with the prisoners on their final journey. When the car got to the predetermined location for the murder, the pilots were offered a chance to get out and urinate. He took the opportunity to do the same. When they were shot, he was urinating and came back to find that they had been killed. He freely gave evidence to the investigators. It didn't help.
From the 1st of July to the 3rd of September 1947, a British military court sat in Hamburg. 18 of those involved in the murders of the escapees were put on trial. Part of the indictment read, against the accused, Emil Weil, Edward Geit and Johannes Schneider, committing a war crime in that they, in the vicinity of Schweitenkirchen, Germany, on or about the 29th of March 1944, when members of the Munich Gestapo, in violation of the laws and usages of war, were concerned in the killing of Lieutenant H.J. Stevens and Lieutenant J.S. Hayes, both of the South African Air Force. prisoners of war. Schneider's defence was that he thought that the two prisoners were looters and desperados. Gates' defence was that he did not hear the orders given by Schaefer at the conference. Weil, whilst admitting that he heard Schaefer's orders at the conference, thought that the prisoners had already been tried by a tribunal and convicted. The British military tribunal sentenced all three men from the Munich Gestapo to death, and they were hanged in February 1948. Oswald Schaefer, the man ultimately responsible, the man who headed the Munich Gestapo, was caught by the West German authorities in the 1950s.
24 years after the Great Escape murders, Schaefer was put before a German court for the killings of the two prisoners of war from South Africa, Flight Lieutenant Stevens and Hayes of the Royal South African Air Force. He had clearly given the order for the murder of the two men, as was shown in the Hamburg trial. But on the 11th of December 1968, he was once more acquitted.
If you are interested to know more about the head of the Munich Gestapo, then you might like to see a longer video on him, a link to which will appear now. I've also got videos related to the Great Escape and the fate of some of the escapees. Thanks for watching. I upload every Tuesday and Friday at 2000 hours Central European time, so you might also be interested in subscribing.